Two boys from Queens recorded their first song for $25, and within a decade, their voices had become the unofficial soundtrack of an entire American generation. Paul Simon wrote every word of it. Art Garfunkel sang those words. And for years, the loudest applause in the room went to the one who hadn't written a single line. That imbalance didn't just end a musical partnership. It poisoned a friendship that had started when both of them were 11 years old, playing make-believe characters in a school play, and it left wounds that neither man ever fully healed. What audiences heard as harmony was, behind closed doors, something closer to two people slowly running out of patience with each other. Paul Simon first spotted Art Garfunkel at a fourth-grade talent show at Public School 164 in Queens, New York, around 1953. They lived only a few blocks apart in a mostly Jewish neighborhood. And what began as a casual friendship deepened quickly over a shared obsession with rock and roll. Radio was everything in those years, and the two of them would spend hours just listening together, absorbing harmonies, trying to understand how their voices could lock into something bigger than either one alone. That instinct for vocal blending wasn't something either of them had to develop. It arrived naturally, and in the beginning, that felt like more than enough to build on. By 1957, when both were 15, they walked into Sanders' recording studio in Manhattan carrying $25 and a song called "Hey Schoolgirl." A music promoter named Sid Prosen happened to catch them that day and recognized something worth betting money on. He signed them to his independent label, Big Records, and they took on the name Tom and Jerry, partly for commercial appeal and partly because they liked the cartoon. Hey Schoolgirl climbed the Billboard charts, sold over 100,000 copies, and earned them a spot on American Bandstand. For two teenagers from Queens, that was the whole dream, and they had already lived a version of it before graduating high school. None of it held. Follow-up singles went nowhere, and the excitement dissolved just as quickly as it had arrived. Both enrolled in college as backup plans, Simon studying English at Queens College, while Garfunkel started with architecture at Columbia University before switching to art history. And for a stretch, the music moved to the background of their lives. What happened next set the tone for everything that came after. In 1958, without a word to Garfunkel, Simon quietly recorded and released a solo single under a false name, True Taylor, and the song True or False slipped into the world in secret. When Garfunkel found out, the betrayal landed hard. That specific wound would reopen again and again over the following 6 decades. And Simon himself acknowledged years later that the memory still carried weight, particularly when he thought about something Garfunkel once said during one of their colder periods. "No matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you." A careless remark, perhaps, but Simon never let it go. Folk music pulled them back together in 1963, 5 years after the falling out. American popular music was shifting in a direction that suited them. Polished commercial pop was giving way to something rawer, more political, and the two of them quietly resumed performing in Greenwich Village venues, playing small clubs under the name Kane and Gar, while the scene around them was changing fast. That's where Tom Wilson found them. Wilson was a jazz producer who was simultaneously helping Bob Dylan transition from acoustic folk to electric rock, and he heard something in their performance worth developing further. He arranged a studio audition, they signed with Columbia Records under their real names, and in October 1964, their debut album, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., arrived in stores to something close to total indifference. 3,000 copies sold. The label had positioned it as exciting new folk sounds at the precise moment when British invasion bands were making acoustic folk feel like a relic. Simon moved to England. Garfunkel returned to Columbia University to study mathematics. By any reasonable reading, that should have been the end of the story. What saved them wasn't a plan either of them made. In the spring of 1965, college radio stations in Boston and Florida started playing the original version of The Sound of Silence, with no particular explanation, and the listener response surprised everyone. Tom Wilson noticed the numbers and pulled the original recording into the studio without contacting either Simon or Garfunkel. He brought in session musicians who layered electric guitars, bass, and drums over the acoustic original. The source tape had tempo inconsistencies, which made it difficult for the players to follow, and engineer Roy Haley masked the rough sections under echo effects. Simon was performing in Denmark when word reached him that the remixed track was climbing the American charts. His first reaction on actually hearing it was that it sounded awkward and wrong. The American public heard something else entirely. On January 1st, 1966, The Sound of Silence reached #1, and Simon and Garfunkel found themselves famous without having done anything to make it happen. Their third album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, followed in October 1966, and represented the moment they found their full recorded sound. An 8-track recording system allowed them to layer vocals cleanly without Simon's guitar bleeding into the mix, and the cleaner production made everything land differently. The album stayed on the Billboard charts for nearly 3 years and sold over 3 million copies. Behind the scenes, some of the credit mechanics were getting uncomfortable. Scarborough Fair, which Simon had learned from British folk musician Martin Carthy, drew on centuries of English folk tradition, but was credited only to Simon and Garfunkel. A collaborator on Cloudy, Bruce Woodley of The Seekers, was paid but received no album credit. None of that slowed the public response. Rolling Stone would eventually rank the album among the greatest ever made, and the Grammy Hall of Fame added it later. In June 1967, they performed at the Monterey Pop Festival alongside Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who. The festival was pure spectacle. Guitars smashed and set alight, amplifiers pushed past their limits, performers trying to outdo each other on the biggest stage American rock and roll had seen. Simon and Garfunkel stood in the middle of all of it and played quietly, precisely. And that contrast was its own kind of statement. Their folk roots weren't a liability at Monterey. They were the thing that made them stand out. That same year, director Mike Nichols came looking for music to carry The Graduate, a film built around alienation, desire, and the particular emptiness underneath American prosperity. Simon had agreed to write 3 new songs for the film, but couldn't finish them while touring, and the film's editor began cutting scenes to existing Simon and Garfunkel recordings in the meantime. The music fit the images so well that Nichols decided to keep it. The Graduate soundtrack went on to compete directly with the Beatles on the charts. Mrs. Robinson won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year, and filmmakers across the industry took note of what popular music could accomplish inside a serious, dramatic film. But while all of this was accumulating publicly, the dynamic inside the partnership was shifting towards something neither of them was talking about openly. Simon wrote every song, and made every substantive decision about how the music would be recorded, arranged, and presented. Garfunkel spent much of his time in studio sessions sitting in the control room with the producer, offering approval and lending his voice when needed. That arrangement produced some of the most admired music in American pop history, and it also produced a specific resentment that Simon has spoken about with uncomfortable honesty in the years since. Every performance of Bridge Over Troubled Water ended the same way. Garfunkel would reach the emotional peak of the song, his clear, choir-trained voice filling the room, and the crowd would rise. Simon stood there watching it, and felt the same thought every single time. He had written that. The voice receiving the standing ovation wasn't the one who had created the music or the words. And underneath that professional frustration lived something older. His mother had told him as a child, plainly and without cruelty, that he had a good voice, but Arthur had a fine voice. That comparison, delivered without malice, became a wound he carried into adulthood, and every time an audience cheered for Garfunkel's vocals, that old sentence came back. Garfunkel carried his own version of the story. He admitted in later interviews that he had wanted to write songs himself, but never believed his material could stand next to Simon's, so he never offered it during the years they worked together. He also admitted something that recontextualized the entire friendship. He had partly befriended Simon when they were children out of pity for his height. framing it as a kind of compensation he offered the shorter boy. Then he added the line that stays with you. That compensation gesture, he said, created a monster. Both men were describing a relationship that had been built on unequal ground from nearly the beginning, and the music, no matter how good it was, couldn't hold that structure up forever. In January 1969, Garfunkel accepted a role in the Mike Nichols film Catch-22. Simon had been cast in the production as well, but his role was written out of the script before filming started. On January 13th, the crew assembled in Guaymas, Mexico, with Garfunkel in the cast and Simon left behind in New York, alone with the unfinished album and a feeling he described in the 2024 documentary In Restless Dreams as being abandoned. Director Charles Grodin later said plainly that you simply don't take Simon and Garfunkel and remove one of them. Garfunkel's stated plan was to finish the film in 6 weeks and return to complete the record. Simon told him directly that wasn't going to happen. The 6-week shoot extended into months, and a long-distance collaboration that followed, Simon sending songs to Mexico and receiving notes back from someone who wasn't there, made everything feel broken. On some tracks of Bridge Over Troubled Water, Garfunkel's voice barely appears. On others, it doesn't appear at all. The Only Living Boy in New York, written during that period of separation, worked almost as an open letter, Simon using their old stage names in the lyrics, Tom, get your plane right on time. And the song captured how far apart they had grown, not just by distance, but by everything that had built up between them. In the summer of 1970, they shared a stage at Forest Hills Stadium in Queens, New York, for what turned out to be their last concert together as a duo. No announcement was made, no argument preceded it. After the second night, they said goodbye, and that was it. Simon described the ending years later with a kind of flat finality. With Artie, there was no reason to talk about it. The door closed quietly, and the world took a while to notice. Their solo careers moved in directions that told the rest of the story. Simon released his first solo album in 1972, followed by There Goes Rhymin' Simon, and then Still Crazy After All These Years, which won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. In 1986, Graceland arrived and changed the conversation about what American popular music could absorb. Drawing on South African township music and the Mbaqanga style, it sold millions of copies globally and demonstrated, as clearly as anything could, that Simon's creative range had nothing to do with Garfunkel's voice. Garfunkel released several albums through the 70s, but none of them found the commercial footing his work with Simon had established, and his recording career grew quieter and less consistent over time. His performances in Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge earned genuine critical praise, calling him a natural actor with real presence, and Simon later admitted he found that particular attention difficult to sit with. He described hearing everyone say how much talent Garfunkel had, how much feeling, and the frustration behind the words was still audible decades later. They recorded My Little Town together in 1975, each releasing it on their own separate solo albums, and the song reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and topped the adult contemporary chart for 2 weeks. They performed it on Saturday Night Live and returned to their separate lives. In 1981, 500,000 people gathered in Central Park in New York City for a reunion concert that became one of the largest in American history, playing 21 songs, starting with Mrs. Robinson, as the light faded over the skyline. The success led to a world tour. Simon admitted later that through most of that tour, the two of them barely spoke to each other. The sharpest cut came in 1983. Following the Central Park concert, they began recording a new album together called Think Too Much, and Garfunkel tracked his vocal contributions carefully. Simon, impatient with the pace of the work, called him and said his voice was being taken off the record. An engineer confirmed that every trace of Garfunkel's vocals was removed from the master tapes. That November, the album appeared under the title Hearts and Bones as a Paul Simon solo project. Garfunkel's voice survived only on bootlegs, including what listeners described as a haunting vocal on Song About the Moon. Nothing that had happened before cut the same way. An engineer erasing someone's voice from music they had recorded together is not a creative decision. It's a statement. By 1993, a critic describing Garfunkel as one of several collaborators during a reunion attempt was enough to ignite something backstage that Simon's own business manager described as terrifying. There were reports of shoving and yelling, and the manager later said he was genuinely afraid of what might happen if a knife had been within reach. When a planned reunion tour in 2010 had to be canceled because of Garfunkel's vocal problems, Simon said publicly that he felt he could no longer trust him. And by 2016, he reduced the whole thing to a single honest sentence. "We don't get along. It's not fun." Two boys who discovered each other at 11 in a Queens schoolroom, who recorded their first song with borrowed money, who wrote and sang music that a generation used to understand its own grief and hope, and who ended up unable to be in the same room without it turning into something dangerous. The songs are still there, untouched by any of it, still doing what they always did. The friendship that produced them is a different story, and unlike the music, it doesn't have a bridge over anything.